Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and it did, in fact, put in a new all time high for the first time in 2025. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. One of the things we talked a lot about just a few weeks ago was that Bitcoin would likely sweep this low here before rallying up to a new all-time high. Now, so far, the new all-time high has been relatively lackluster because it kind of just did the same thing that it did with the low, where it just swept the high, right? It swept the low here, and then it swept the high here. We haven't really seen any major breakout in either direction. Okay? It sort of seems like the market is sort of in limbo, waiting for news to break of what's the outlook for a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Obviously, there's been a lot of speculation building up to that. People have been talking about it for a long time. And now that the new administration has started, I imagine that is one of the reasons why the market is kind of stalling out, waiting for something, right? A catalyst to ultimately move up. One of the things you'll notice is that last year, around this time, Bitcoin did something very similar, where it was putting in higher highs, right? It was putting in higher highs here. And it also swept the low, right? You can see that it swept the low right there. The argument is that, well, it has done something very similar this time, right? It was also putting in higher highs, and then it swept the low, right? And when it swept the low, it was above the bull market support band back over here, just like it was above the bull market support band here in early 2025. What happened next for Bitcoin in 2024 was it broke through the prior high. It broke through the prior high and continued up to the higher high structure. So we had talked about that outcome as well. But so far, Bitcoin has not been able to durably break through that high like it did back over here. If you zoom in over here, you can see that Bitcoin really had no problem breaking through, right? It just rallied on up, broke through, and went back to that higher high structure. Now, if Bitcoin were to go back up to the higher high structure, that would obviously, it would be a decent percent gain from the current high, right? It'd be another 8% or so higher. Just something to think about. But there's other relevant comparisons as well, one of which we talked about as it relates to the 10-year yield. We know that there's one other time this cycle, ever since the bull market began, where Bitcoin had some trouble really durably breaking out, and it was back over here in July of 2023. Now the conditions are not exactly the same, right? We have to admit that, but you'll notice that back over there was also it wasn't as well defined necessarily, but there was a range low, and after Bitcoin swept the range low, it then went up and swept the range high a couple of times, but it wasn't really able to break out until it came back down and then went back up in Q4. We're not really at the same time of year, but the only reason I'm mentioning it is because back then we also saw the 10-year yield, in a fairly sizable rally, which is arguably what it's doing right now, right? So I think that it's a difficult market because obviously everyone has very strong opinions about what's going to happen. And, stuff like a strategic Bitcoin reserve is going to be talked about a lot. It kind of feels like the market is hanging on, when's it going to happen, right? And when is there going to be mention of this stuff? Because so far, there hasn't really been any mention of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen the market really continue that move. You also have to remember that when you do get new administrations, it can introduce uncertainty into the market for a while, and the market has to grapple with that as it figures out, what is the new administration going to be about. I think that has had, that can have some effects as well. If you actually look at the markets back well before Bitcoin was around, there's certainly a lot of times where the market just goes up after you have, after you introduce a new administration. For instance, in 2017, in fact, with the S&P, you can see that when Trump was inaugurated in 2017, right, the market pretty quickly went higher in February, right? But if you go back to earlier times, there are examples where it didn't play out like that. Like if you go back to 1981, you can see that, when I think this was Reagan took office, the market sold off first and then rallied back up in March, and then it struggled for a while, and then it really got moving later on during that administration. If you go back to the 1970s, you'll find, similar things, right? You'll find examples of both, right? Some of the times the market sold off as a new administration came in, and other times, right? Like here's a good example of it selling off as a new administration came in. But then other times, like if you go back even further, you'll find that, for instance, in January of, let's see, this was December of 68. So in December of 64, right, January 65, you'll see that there was a little bit of a sell-off, but the market ultimately continued to go higher for a while. And then you had a larger sell-off, which really, I imagine, spooked the market. But you still had another rally, which led to a right translated cycle. So you basically have two types of cycles. You have right translated, where you get a 1-year bear market, and then you have left translated, where you get a 2-year bear market. So I think, maybe the market's grappling with that as to whether, we will see that next move. Hopefully we get another move higher, and hopefully it can take Bitcoin back up to this higher high structure, just like it did last year at this time. One of the things I wanted to mention was just sort of checking back in with the comparison with the QQQ. It's been a while since we mentioned it. It was something I really talked about back in March of 2024, was that we noted there were a lot of similarities between Bitcoin and the QQQ. And just as a reminder, when the QQQ launched, it actually had a fairly sizable rally where it rallied from 48 to 120, and then it got a correction, right? That correction occurred 55 weeks later, right? So we're actually currently, the correction by the QQQ happened 55 weeks later. With Bitcoin, we're currently in week 54. Okay, so I wouldn't expect the analog to hold exactly because none of them ever do. But we are in week 54. Week 55 will be next week. So if there is some type of, drop next week, then my guess, or at some point in the next few months, my guess is that it would lead to the reintroduction of quantitative easing, right? So I kind of think that is what the market is digesting right now. Like on one hand, it seems like the market is looking for a reason to try to continue to put in new all-time highs, but the longer that it waits, the more it might struggle to do that. So I would argue this. I would say this. If Bitcoin, if it's going to be similar to what happened over here, then it will just simply struggle to durably break above 110, right? It'll just, it'll get up there, but it won't really go higher. So if you see it struggling to stay above this level, then the odds go up a lot that it's more similar to that, right? And then it would mean Bitcoin getting back below 90K, and then, giving back some of these gains, potentially having to consolidate at a lower level before then hopefully moving back up once again. If it's going to play out like last year in January, then the expectation, I think, would be that it should be able to break out relatively soon. Now, it could be that we're so close to the labor market data in a couple of weeks that Bitcoin is doing what it has done a lot, and that is move back up to sort of a high and then wait for the labor market data to come in. If you look at 2024, this move up really didn't occur until after the labor market data for February came in. Okay, so you could argue that this isn't even the fairest comparison because this move didn't occur until February, and we're still in January. But I did think that, it's important to try to remain level headed about this stuff. It's easy to let the emotions go and to, get super excited and say this is what has to happen. But again, no one knows. And I know a lot of people sort of lash out and make fun when you don't take, a super strong stance. But as I've said, I mean, everything's just dubious speculation. I try to just stick to the risk levels, and I try to outline different scenarios that seem likely or that I think warrant our attention the most, right? And the two main scenarios that I think are relevant right now would be the higher high structure that if it repeats what the QQQ did would actually correspond to 120, which coincidentally enough, right, if it were to go up to the higher high structure, it would be around 120, right? If we actually get this, if we make this trend line actually accurate, right? And put this price label down there, you can see it would actually correspond right around 120, which is exactly where the QQQ went 54 weeks after it launched. And we're currently in week 54. Um, you could argue that doing something like that, if it were to mimic the QQQ, that might not be the best thing, right? I mean, maybe it would even, not be the worst thing if we did go back down for a little while and consolidate, and then potentially just have a right translated cycle like we normally do in Q4 of post halving year. So I think that the two most relevant scenarios right now, especially with Bitcoin having put in an all-time high but not yet showing the ability to break through durably. Scenario one, anytime Bitcoin puts in a new all-time high, it's always relevant to think, all right, well, if it does break through, right, if this is just sort of a sign of what's to come, what would be the next main level? And I think it would be right here, right? The same thing that it did in 2024, right? Where it swept the low and then rallied back up to the higher high structure. And then it even got another move in March where it went above the higher high structure. I would say this is one main scenario to consider. The other one in the short term is that if Bitcoin can't really stay above that level, above 110, then it does start to call back into question this analog right here, where it kind of kept sweeping the highs, but it didn't really see that breakout. And the only reason I mention that scenario is because that was also during a period of time when the long end of the yield curve was rallying. Now, recently, the long end of the yield curve has stopped rallying, right? I mean, the long end of the yield curve, if you look at like the 10-year yield, it's actually been dropping. If it continues to drop, then, I guess it depends on why it's dropping. If it drops because of inflation, inflation's dropping, it's probably a good thing for risk assets. If it drops because the labor market's really showing weakness, that would be a bad thing. So I guess it always depends on why it would be dropping. But the only reason I make that summer 2023 comparison is because that's exactly what the 10-year yield was there. I mean, it was doing kind of a similar thing, right? Where it was, moving up and doing that same structure where it was putting in these lower highs and then back testing the 21-week EMA, right? So if you see what I'm saying, right? Back testing that 21-week EMA, same thing right there after breaking out, right? You sort of get a breakout and then a back test, and then it moved up, and then it moved up. And here, even last year, you can see that, or in 2023, there was a move up to this level, and then it had a correction for a week or two, and then it still had another rally. So do be aware that that is an outcome that is relevant. To be completely honest, earlier today, it seemed a little bit more likely that the higher high structure was more favored, and it still might be, but the only thing that gives me a little bit of pause is that, last year when it broke through this structure, it had no problem breaking through, right? It didn't then get a big pullback after breaking that level, and it just made me think of, okay, well, what is other times this cycle where it sort of just swept a high rather than continue on, right? And you can see a few examples, like here, where it swept this local high, but then didn't get any follow through. Here's another example where it's kind of just swept it. Here's another example where it just swept it. And then here is another example where it just swept that high. Here's another example, right? So, and here's another one. So I think that going into this, it seemed a little bit more likely that Bitcoin would go up to this higher high structure, potentially as early as this week, right? And it still very well could. Um, but the fact that it hasn't taken out that level and wasn't able to hold it makes me question it a little bit, right? It makes me question it a little bit. Makes me wonder if, the market's going to do something different to really keep us on our toes. And so I think that's what I think that's sort of the focus right now is why is Bitcoin not making this push durably to a new high? And, is there a reason for it? I kind of feel like it's just waiting for some news, even though I do ultimately think price dictates narrative, not the other way around. It seems like it wants a catalyst, right? Some type of catalyst to send this higher. And if the catalyst never comes, right? Like if we're just twiddling our thumbs for a couple weeks and it just never comes, then that's how you could see what happened in 2023 play out, where then it just eventually goes back to the range lows after sweeping the highs, right? And you might have to consolidate longer before then hoping, potentially getting another move higher later on. But I mean, all in all, it was a fairly exciting day because any day that Bitcoin puts in a new all-time high is a good day. And we'll see, we'll see. I think the hope is that we just simply get a right translated cycle where the peak occurs in Q4 of the post-halving year, right? Q4 2021. And then, of course, there was Q4 of 2017 and Q4 of 2013. The only way that that wouldn't happen, in my opinion, is if the S&P 500 gets a left translated cycle where the top occurs earlier than it normally does. The only reason that normally happens is if inflation is accelerating or the unemployment rate is accelerating. If one of those two things are accelerating, that's how you can get a left translated peak. If they're not accelerating, then you'd be much more likely to get a right translated peak. So I know the inflation videos and the unemployment, labor market videos are kind of boring, but the reason we talk about it is to try to figure out, what type of market cycle is this going to be. I hope that the Fed is able to engineer a soft landing where, the unemployment rate doesn't have to go up a lot more and inflation also doesn't continue to go up. The main concerning things right now is just that inflation has been slowly moving up, but I don't think the market's going to really care about that until you see a big move up. And the good news, though, is the unemployment rate has kind of stalled out for a little bit, right? I mean, it's kind of stalled out here. Counterpoint, of course, if you take like a 3-month SMA, it also stalled out last year around this time and then started moving up again in Q1. So I think that's kind of the counterpoint to it to give you some evidence potentially of a left translated cycle, but there's no guarantee, right? The market, the market's pricing in the data that it has access to, and there's always a chance that you could see a soft landing. There are times where you get an uninverted yield curve and you still don't see a recession for a year or two. There's other times where it happens almost immediately. But for now, Bitcoin is at 102K, and I think that as long as, it's above 100K, the higher high structure holds a little bit more weight. If you see it really stay below 100K, then I think you really have to start questioning whether we're going to revisit the range lows again, kind of like we did over here, right after sweeping the high, right? And then just kind of come back down once again. But anyways, guys, that'll wrap it up for the video. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on ITC Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.